Hello, everyone, and welcome to Background Interview. I'm your host, Lily, and this is the show where we bring you fascinating conversations with legendary figures from throughout history. Whether you're commuting to work, doing household chores, or just relaxing, our podcast is designed to enrich your mind while you go about your day. We're broadcasting in 12 languages to listeners around the world. Yes, that includes you. So how's everyone doing today? I was just thinking this morning about how my coffee maker broke down, and I had to resort to instant coffee. And then I realized I'm basically living like it's the 1920s again. Speaking of the 1920s, we have an absolutely extraordinary guest with us today. Someone who knew that era like the back of his hand, who built an empire during one of America's most turbulent decades. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the man who needs no introduction, the King of Chicago himself.
Well. Good evening, everyone.
Please, both of you, let's have a seat and get comfortable.
It's been a long time since I've been introduced as anything other than public enemy number one. The name's Al Capone, though most folks called me Scarface back in the day. Born in Brooklyn, raised in the streets, and I made Chicago my kingdom.
Now, Al, I have to ask, did you really own a gold-plated toothpick?
Ha! You've been reading too many newspapers, sweetheart. Though I did have a fondness for fine things, I'll give you that.
Well, Al, let's start from the beginning. You were born in Brooklyn in 1899 to Italian immigrant parents. Tell us about growing up in that environment.
Brooklyn in those days. It was rough, you understand. My old man, Gabrielle, he worked hard, first as a barber, then in a grocery store. My mother, Teresa, she was the backbone of our family. We were poor, but we had each other.
What was it like being part of an Italian immigrant family in New York at that time?
Look, we weren't welcome anywhere. The Irish had their neighborhoods, the Jews had theirs, and us Italians? We got whatever was left. People looked at us like we were dirt, like we didn't belong in America.
That must have been incredibly frustrating for a young man.
Frustrating? That's putting it mildly, doll. You know what it's like when teachers can't even pronounce your name right? When kids at school make fun of your accent, your clothes, the food your mother packs for lunch?
I can only imagine how that shaped your worldview.
It taught me that in this country, you either make your own rules or you get trampled. Nobody was going to hand me nothing on a silver platter.
When did you first encounter the world of organized crime?
I was maybe 14, 15. There was this guy, Johnny Torrio, smart as a whip, that one. He ran numbers, small-time gambling, but he did it with class. He saw something in me.
What do you think he saw?
Hunger, ambition, and maybe a little bit of the devil. Johnny, he taught me that crime ain't just about muscle. It's about brains, organization, knowing when to fight and when to make a deal.
You moved to Chicago in 1919. What was it like when you first arrived?
Chicago was like stepping into the future, All those tall buildings, the noise, the energy. But underneath all that glamour, it was just as dirty as Brooklyn. Maybe dirtier.
And this was right around the time Prohibition was about to start.
Ah, Prohibition. The greatest gift the government ever gave to guys like me. January 17th, 1920. The day they made it illegal to drink alcohol in America. Can you imagine telling Americans they can't have a drink after a hard day's work?
It seems almost unthinkable now.
It was the stupidest law ever written. You know what happened? They created a black market overnight. Suddenly, every speakeasy, every bootlegger, every guy with a still in his basement was a criminal. And somebody had to organize all that chaos.
And that somebody was you.
Me and a lot of other smart fellas. But yeah, I had a talent for organization. I could see the big picture while other guys were still fighting over street corners.
Tell us about building your organization. How did you structure it?
You gotta understand, we weren't just a bunch of thugs running around with guns. We were businessmen. We had accountants, lawyers, drivers, guards, We had guys who specialized in different things. Some handled the breweries, some ran the speakeasies, some dealt with the cops.
It sounds almost like a corporation.
That's exactly what it was. I always said I was just a businessman giving people what they wanted. People wanted to drink, so I provided drinks. People wanted entertainment, so I provided clubs and gambling. What's wrong with that?
But there was violence involved.
Violence? In business? Shocking! Look, sweetheart, you think the oil companies and the railroad barons built their empires by being nice? The only difference was that what I did was illegal. But illegal don't mean immoral.
Let's talk about the scale of your operation. How big was the alcohol business?
At our peak, we were moving thousands of gallons a week. We had breweries, distilleries, import operations from Canada. We supplied half the speakeasies in Chicago and a good chunk of the Midwest.
The money must have been incredible.
Money was just a way of keeping score. But yeah, we were pulling in maybe $100 million a year. In 1920s, money, that's like, what, $1 billion today?
And you controlled all of this from Chicago.
Chicago was my town. Every cop, every judge, every politician, they all knew who really ran things. I wasn't hiding in some basement somewhere. I lived in the open, went to the opera, ate at the finest restaurants. People respected me because I brought order to chaos.
But that also made you a target.
Sure it did. You can't be on top without making enemies. Other gangs wanted what I had. The feds wanted to bring me down. But I had something most of them didn't have.
Which was?
Loyalty. Real loyalty. My guys would take a bullet for me because they knew I'd take one for them. That ain't something you can buy with money.
Speaking of enemies, let's talk about your rivals. Who were the main threats?
Oh, there were plenty. Bugs Moran and his North Side gang, they were always trying to muscle in on our territory. Dean O'Banion, now there was a dangerous man, charming as hell, but ruthless. The Jenna brothers from the West Side. Chicago was carved up like a turkey, and everybody wanted a bigger piece.
How did you handle the competition?
First, I tried negotiation. Always better to make a deal than make war. But some guys, they only understand one language. When somebody threatens your family, your business, your way of life, well, you do what you have to do.
The violence must have been intense.
Violence was a tool, nothing more. You use it when you have to, but you don't use it for fun. Any fool can pull a trigger. It takes brains to know when not to.
What about the police? How did you manage those relationships?
The cops? Half of them were on my payroll. Look, these guys were making maybe $30 a week, and I could offer them 10 times that just to look the other way. It wasn't corruption, it was survival. They had families to feed, just like everybody else.
And the ones who wouldn't take your money?
Those were the dangerous ones. Honest cops are bad for business. But I respected them, in a way. At least you knew where they stood.
What about the federal agents?
The feds. Now those guys were a different breed. They couldn't be bought, couldn't be intimidated. Elliot Ness and his untouchables. They were like a pack of hunting dogs. They just kept coming, no matter what.
How did the public see you? You were almost like a celebrity.
The newspapers loved me. I sold papers. Scarface Al does this. Capone says that. To some people I was a monster. To others I was Robin Hood. I gave jobs to thousands of people during the Depression. I opened soup kitchens when the government couldn't feed the hungry.
You saw yourself as helping people?
I was helping people. Who do you think was buying my booze? Doctors, lawyers, judges, society ladies. I was providing a service that people wanted. The only difference between me and a legitimate businessman was that my product happened to be illegal.
But there were innocent people who got hurt.
Innocent people get hurt in every business. How many people die in coal mines? How many get sick from factory work? At least I was honest about what I was doing.
Let's talk about loyalty and betrayal. In your world, those concepts must have meant everything.
Loyalty was the only currency that mattered. Money comes and goes. Power can be lost overnight. But a man's word, that's eternal.
Did you ever have to deal with betrayal from within your organization?
Of course. It It's the nature of the business. When there's big money involved, some people get greedy. They forget who gave them their start, who protected them when times were tough.
How did you handle those situations?
Swift and decisive. You can't let betrayal go unpunished. Not because you're cruel, but because it sends a message. If word gets out that you're soft, that you'll tolerate disloyalty, then you're finished.
That's a harsh way to live.
It's a harsh world, doll. You think the bankers and the politicians are any different? They just use lawyers instead of guns.
Now, we have to talk about February 14th, 1929, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
Ah, the newspapers really went wild with that one. 7 men dead in a garage on North Clark Street. The whole country was talking about it.
Were you responsible for what happened that day?
I was in Miami, Florida, talking to the district attorney down there. Got about 100 witnesses who can vouch for that. But did I shed any tears over what happened? Not particularly.
Those were Bugs Moran's men.
Those were soldiers in a war. They knew the risks. Moran had been trying to kill me for months. He hit my guys, I hit his guys. That's how it worked. The only surprise was that it took as long as it did.
But the public reaction was intense.
Yes, suddenly everybody was shocked that gangsters were shooting each other. Like this was something new. The only difference was the scale of it. 7 guys at once made for better headlines than 1 guy at a time.
The massacre marked a turning point. The federal government really came after you after that.
The heat was already on before that. President Hoover, he wanted my head on a platter. Made it a personal mission to bring me down. They couldn't get me on murder, couldn't get me on bootlegging. So they got creative.
They got you on tax evasion.
Tax evasion. Can you believe that? Here I am running a multi-million-dollar operation, and they get me because I didn't file the right paperwork. It's almost funny, if you think about it.
Why didn't you just pay your taxes?
How do you pay taxes on illegal income? You go to the tax office and say, here's my earnings from bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution. They'd laugh you right into a jail cell.
The trial was a sensation. Why did you choose to remain mostly silent?
My lawyers told me to keep my mouth shut, and for once in my life, I listened to advice. Besides, what was I going to say? Your Honor, I'm innocent? Everybody in that courtroom knew exactly who I was and what I'd done. The fix was in from the start.
You were sentenced to 11 years and sent to Alcatraz.
The Rock. Now that was a real prison. No special treatment, no favors, no way out. Just concrete, steel, and the sound of waves crashing against the rocks.
What was life like on Alcatraz?
Brutal, mind-numbing, soul-crushing. You wake up at the same time every day, eat the same slop, stare at the same walls, and all around you, the worst criminals in America, murderers, bank robbers, kidnappers. Real hard cases.
How did they treat you?
With respect, mostly. My reputation preceded me, but respect only goes so far when you're all locked up together. Some guys tried to make a name for themselves by going after me. That didn't work out too well for them.
You were already suffering from syphilis when you went to prison.
Yeah, that was the real enemy. The disease ate away at my mind, bit by bit. There were days I couldn't remember my own name. Days I thought I was still running Chicago from my cell.
That must have been terrifying.
You know what's terrifying? Losing control. My whole life, I was the guy who made the decisions, who saw the angles, who stayed 3 steps ahead, and then, slowly, that all started slipping away.
Your family visited you, though.
May, my wife, she was a saint, came to see me whenever she could. My son, Sonny, too. Poor kid had to grow up with everybody knowing who his father was. That's my biggest regret, what my choices did to them.
Let's talk about your relationship with your family. They were everything to you, weren't they?
Family was sacred. Still is. You could threaten me, you could try to kill me, but you never, ever went after my family. That was a line nobody crossed. Not if they wanted to keep breathing.
May stuck with you through everything.
May was tougher than any gangster I ever knew. She knew what I was when she married me, but she never judged, never complained. When I was in prison, when I was sick, when I was nothing but a broken down old man, she was still there.
And your son?
Sonny was born deaf in one ear. Kids used to tease him about that, about his father. I tried to give him everything I never had. Education, opportunities, a chance at a legitimate life. I didn't want him following in my footsteps.
Did you ever regret the life you chose?
Regret? That's a luxury I couldn't afford. You make your choices, you live with the consequences. But if I could do it over, maybe I'd have tried the straight and narrow first. Maybe I'd have given my family a different kind of life.
You were a Catholic, despite everything. How did you reconcile your faith with your lifestyle?
God and I had our conversations. I figured he understood that sometimes a man has to do what a man has to do. I went to church, I said my prayers, I tried to be good to people when I could. The rest, well, I figured I'd settle up with the big guy when my time came.
Did you think you were a good person?
I thought I was a practical person. Good and bad are luxuries for people who don't have to worry about putting food on the table. I protected my family, I took care of my people, I gave jobs to thousands. If that ain't good, then I don't know what is.
When you were released from prison in 1939, the world had changed.
Everything was different. Prohibition was over, the gangs had moved on, Chicago barely remembered me. I was 40 years old, but I felt like an old man. The syphilis had rotted my brain. I could barely think straight most days.
You retired to Florida.
Retired? I was finished, doll. Done. Washed up. I spent my last years fishing, playing cards, trying to remember who I used to be. Sometimes May would find me talking to people who weren't there. Old friends, dead enemies, making deals that existed only in my head.
That must have been heartbreaking for your family.
It was the final insult. All those years, all that power, all that money. And in the end, I couldn't even control my own mind. I died on January 25th, 1947. Cardiac arrest. May said I went peacefully, but I don't remember much about those final days.
Looking back, what do you think success and failure meant in your life?
Success? I owned a city. I built an empire from nothing. I went from being a poor immigrant kid to the most famous criminal in America. Failure? I lost everything. My freedom, my health, my mind. I put my family through hell, and for what?
Do you think you achieved the American dream?
I achieved a version of it. The American dream is about rising above your circumstances, right? About making something of yourself when the deck is stacked against you. Well, I did that. Maybe not the way the history books like to tell it, but I did it.
But at what cost?
Everything has a cost, sweetheart. The question is whether you're willing to pay it. I paid with my freedom, my health, my peace of mind. Was it worth it? Ask me on a good day, I might say yes. Ask me on a bad day. Well, you'd get a different answer.
Your story has been told in countless movies and books. How do you feel about your legacy?
Hollywood loves a good gangster story. Half of what they show in those movies is complete nonsense. The other half, well, maybe they're not so far off.
What do they get wrong?
They make it seem glamorous. All the fancy clothes, the fast cars, the beautiful women. Sure, there was some of that. But most of it was just business. Meetings, planning, dealing with problems, keeping people in line. Not as exciting as the movies make it look.
And what do they get right?
The violence was real. The money was real. The power was real. And so was the price you paid for all of it.
If you were alive today, what do you think you'd be doing?
That's a hell of a question. Maybe I'd be running a legitimate business. Corporate America could use a guy who knows how to get things done. Or maybe I'd be in politics. Same skills, different arena. Hell, maybe I'd be a consultant, teaching people how to negotiate, how to read people, how to build loyalty.
Do you think organized crime still exists today?
Are you kidding? It's bigger than ever. It just wears better suits and uses computers instead of Tommy guns. The methods change, but the principles stay the same. Supply and demand, protection, territory, loyalty. Human nature doesn't change, no matter what century you're in.
What would you say to young people today who might be tempted by the criminal life?
I'd tell them to think twice. Sure, there's money to be made, respect to be earned, power to be grabbed, but there's also prison, violence, and a shortened life expectancy. Most guys who go into this life don't live to see their 40th birthday.
But some do make it out.
Some do, but at what cost? You lose pieces of yourself along the way. Your innocence, your trust, your ability to love without fear. Everything becomes a transaction. Everyone becomes a potential enemy. That's no way to live.
Do you believe people can change? Can someone like you find redemption?
Change? Maybe. Redemption? That's between a man and his maker. I did terrible things. Hurt people, destroyed families, spread violence and fear. But I also helped people. Fed the hungry, protected the weak, gave opportunities to those who had none. Does the good balance out the bad? I don't know. That's not for me to judge.
What do you think defines a person? Their worst actions or their best intentions?
Both. Neither. Hell, I don't know. People aren't simple. They're complicated, contradictory, capable of great good and great evil, sometimes in the same day. Maybe that's what makes us human.
Tell us about your philosophy of power and fear.
Power without fear is just noise. Fear without power is just terror. You need both, but you need to use them wisely. Real power comes from people choosing to follow you, not because they have to, but because they want to.
But you did use fear as a tool.
Of course I did. Sometimes it was the only language people understood, but I never used it carelessly. Fear is like a loaded gun. Handle it wrong and it'll blow up in your face. The smart play is to let people know you're capable of violence without actually having to use it.
That sounds almost philosophical.
I had a lot of time to think in prison. You start to see patterns, understand motivations, figure out what really drives people. Money, sex, power, respect, survival. Those are the big five. Everything else is just window dressing.
When you had to make difficult decisions, especially violent ones, what went through your mind?
Business. Pure and simple. This isn't personal, it's just business. That's what I told myself. But late at night, when the noise died down and I was alone with my thoughts, sometimes I wondered if there was another way.
Did you ever try to find another way?
A few times. Negotiations, compromises, deals that should have worked. But in my world, showing weakness was like bleeding in shark-infested waters. Every time I tried to be reasonable, somebody took it as a sign that I was going soft. And that usually meant more violence, not less.
So you felt trapped by your own reputation?
In a way, yeah, once people see you as a monster, they expect you to act like one. And if you don't live up to their expectations, they test you. And testing me was never a good idea.
What did protecting your people really mean to you?
Everything. These weren't just employees, they were family. Most of them came from the same streets I did. Poor, desperate, looking for a chance. I gave them that chance. I gave them purpose, money, respect. In return, they gave me their loyalty.
But you also put them in danger.
Life put them in danger. I just gave them a way to fight back. You think those guys had a lot of other options? Work in a factory for pennies, starve on the streets, get drafted into some rich man's war? At least with me, they had a chance to make something of themselves.
Even if it meant risking their lives?
We all risk our lives every day just by getting out of bed. The difference is, my guys knew the risks going in, and they knew I'd move heaven and earth to protect them if things went wrong.
You mentioned earlier that money, power, and fear dominated your life. Is there anything else that mattered?
Love, family, honor in its own twisted way. I loved my wife, my son, my mother. I honored my obligations to my friends. And I took pride in my work, even if society didn't approve of what that work was.
Pride in criminal work?
Pride in excellence. I was good at what I did. I built something from nothing, created order from chaos, turned street thugs into businessmen. Not many people can say they dominated an entire city for as long as I did. Right or wrong, that takes skill.
And now, looking back, what would you want people to understand about Al Capone?
That I was human. Flawed, complicated, capable of both cruelty and kindness. I wasn't born a monster. I was made into one by circumstances, choices, and yes, my own ambition. But I was also a man who loved his family, who helped his community when I could, who tried to live by a code, even when that code was rejected by society.
Al, I want to thank you for this incredible conversation. Your insights into that era, into the complexities of power and survival, have been absolutely fascinating. Was there anything here tonight that surprised you about our discussion? Well, let's hear from our audience now. We've received some fantastic questions from our viewers. Our first question comes from Marcus Thompson in Detroit. Marcus writes, Mr. Capone, do you think the violence and organized crime was necessary, or were there alternatives you could have pursued?
Marcus, that's a damn good question. Look, violence was the currency of my world. You didn't choose it. It chose you. Were there alternatives? Maybe. But when you're dealing with people who only respect force, negotiation becomes a luxury you can't afford. I tried talking first, always. But when words fail, and your family's safety is on the line, you do what you have to do. Could I have walked away from it all? Sure. But that would have meant abandoning the hundreds of people who depended on me. Sometimes the moral choice isn't the one that looks cleanest on paper.
That's a fascinating perspective on the complexities of leadership in impossible circumstances. Our next question comes from Sarah Mitchell in Boston. Sarah asks, I'm going through a difficult time in my life and feel like I have to choose between my principles and my survival. How did you handle moral conflicts?
Sarah, honey, that's the question that kept me awake more nights than I care to remember. You know what I learned? Sometimes there ain't no good choice, just choices you can live with. I told myself I was protecting my family, providing for my community, bringing order to chaos. And you know what? Most of the time, that was true. But I also knew I was breaking laws, hurting people, spreading fear. The trick is being honest with yourself about both sides of the coin. Don't lie to yourself about what you're doing, but don't ignore why you're doing it either. And whatever choice you make, you better be prepared to live with the consequences. Because those consequences will find you, one way or another.
That's incredibly honest advice. Thank you for sharing that wisdom with Sarah. Our final viewer question comes from Robert Chen in San Francisco. Robert writes, what would you say was the most important lesson you learned about human nature during your time as a crime boss?
Robert, that's easy. People are exactly who they show you they are when everything's on the line. You can know somebody for years, think you understand them completely, but you never really know until they have to choose between their loyalty and their survival. Most people will surprise you. Sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. The guys who talked the biggest game often crumbled when the pressure was on. And the quiet ones, the ones you barely noticed, they were sometimes the most dependable. But here's the thing that really got to me. Deep down, most people just want to belong to something bigger than themselves. They want to feel important, respected, valued. Give them that, and they'll follow you to hell and back. Take it away, and they'll turn on you faster than you can blink. Human nature ain't good or bad. It's just human. Predictable in some ways, completely unpredictable in others.
What a profound observation about the human condition. Al, thank you so much for taking the time to answer these thoughtful questions from our viewers. And thank you to everyone who wrote in. Keep those questions coming. Now, let's open it up to our studio audience. Who has a question for Mr. Capone tonight? Yes, you there in the third row. Let me just make my way over here. You know, this reminds me of my dating life. Always walking toward potential disaster. Hi there. What's your name? Victoria. Nice to meet you. What's your question for Mr. Capone? Oh, wow. That's a really thoughtful question about redemption and second chances. Al, Victoria wants to know, do you believe someone who has done terrible things can ever truly redeem themselves, or are we forever defined by our worst moments?
Victoria, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I've wrestled with that my whole life, especially in my final years. Here's what I think. Redemption isn't about erasing what you've done. You can't undo the past. But maybe, just maybe, you can find a way to balance the scales a little bit. Every day you choose to be better than you were yesterday, that's a small victory. Every person you help instead of hurt, every time you choose compassion over cruelty, that matters. Are we defined by our worst moments? Partly, yeah. Those moments are part of who we are. But we're also defined by what we do after those moments. How we learn, how we grow, how we try to make amends. True redemption? I don't know if that exists this side of heaven, but the attempt to redeem yourself? That's noble. That's human. That's worth something.
Thank you for that question, Victoria. That was beautifully answered. Do we have another question from the audience? You, sir, in the blue shirt. Here I go again, walking into the unknown, just like when I tried to assemble IKEA furniture last weekend. Hello, what's your name? Nice to meet you, David. What would you like to ask our guest? That's a fascinating question about leadership and fear. Al, David asks, how do you distinguish between being a strong leader and being a tyrant? Where's the line?
David, that's a question every leader should ask themselves every damn day. The difference between a leader and a tyrant? A leader serves his people. A tyrant serves himself. Now, I ain't gonna pretend I was always on the right side of that line. There were times when my ego, my anger, my fear drove my decisions instead of what was best for my organization. But most of the time, I tried to think about what would protect and provide for the people who depended on me. A tyrant rules through fear alone. A leader earns respect, and fear is just one tool in the toolbox. The best leaders make people want to follow them, not just force them to. But here's the hard truth. Sometimes good leaders have to make tyrant-like decisions. When someone threatens your people, when there's no other way to protect what you've built, you might have to do something terrible to prevent something worse. The key is not enjoying it, not letting it become your first option instead of your last resort.
That's a very nuanced answer. Thank you, David, for that excellent question. One more question. This will be our last one from the audience tonight. Yes, you in the back. One more journey across the stage. This is more exercise than I've gotten all week. Hi there. What's your name? Hello, Maria. What's your question for Mr. Capone? Oh, that's a very personal question about family and legacy. Al, Maria wants to know, if you could send one message to your son, what would it be?
Maria, that hits me right in the heart. If I could talk to Sonny one more time, I'd tell him that he was the best thing I ever did. Everything else, the money, the power, the fame, the fear, all of it was just noise. But watching him grow up, seeing him become a good man despite having me as a father, that was real. I'd tell him I'm sorry for the burden my name put on him, for the whispers he had to endure, for the doors that closed because of who his father was. But I'd also tell him I'm proud of how he handled it all, how he chose to be better than me. And I'd tell him that love doesn't end just because someone dies, that the best parts of who we are live on in the people we love, even when we're gone. Sonny took the good parts of me and left the bad parts buried. That's the greatest gift a father could ask for.
Thank you so much, Maria. What a beautiful question. And thank you to our wonderful audience for these incredible questions. Coming back to the stage now.
You've got some smart people out there, Lily. Those were some of the best questions I've ever been asked.
Our audience always brings such thoughtful perspectives to these conversations. Now, before we wrap up, I'm curious, which of those questions resonated most with you tonight? You know, Al, I have a couple of personal questions I've been dying to ask. If you had never gotten involved in organized crime, what do you think you would have done with your life?
That's a hell of a question to ask an old ghost like me. You know, I was pretty good with numbers even as a kid. Maybe I would have been an accountant or a bookkeeper, or maybe I would have opened a restaurant. I always loved good food and bringing people together. Hell, maybe I would have gone into politics. Same skills, different arena, like I said before. The truth is, I had ambition, drive, organizational skills. Those could have taken me anywhere, but I grew up in a world where crime seemed like the fastest way out of poverty. Maybe if I'd had different role models, different opportunities, things would have been different.
Do you think you would have been as successful in legitimate business?
Success? Define success, sweetheart. If you mean money and power, maybe not as much. Legal businesses have rules, regulations, competition, but if you mean satisfaction, peace of mind, a clean conscience, yeah, maybe I would have been more successful than I ever was as a criminal.
Here's another one. If you could go back and give your younger self one piece of advice, what would it be?
Just one piece? That's tough. I guess I'd tell young Al to think longer term. I was always focused on the immediate problem, the quick solution, the fast payoff. But every choice you make echoes down through the years. That quick buck you grab today might cost you everything tomorrow. I'd tell him to be smarter about who he trusted, more careful about who he hurt, and more thoughtful about what kind of legacy he wanted to leave. But knowing me, young Al probably wouldn't have listened anyway. Young men think they're immortal, invincible. They think the rules don't apply to them. Sometimes you have to learn the hard way.
That's incredibly wise advice for anyone, not just your younger self. All right, everyone. How about we test your knowledge of our guest with a little quiz?
A quiz? About me? This ought to be interesting.
Music, please. Here's your first question, audience. Al Capone's famous scar came from a fight over a woman at a Brooklyn nightclub, but what did his attacker use to cut him? Raise your fist if you think it was a broken bottle, or show me your open palm if you think it was a knife. Interesting. I'm seeing more fists than palms, so most of you think it was a broken bottle. Al, what's the real story?
It was a knife, actually. A punk named Frank Galluccio slashed me during a fight at the Harvard Inn. I made some comment about his sister that I shouldn't have made. He caught me across the left side of my face with a straight razor. Funny thing is, years later, Frank ended up working for me as a bodyguard. I respected a man who stood up for his family, even if it meant cutting up my pretty face.
What an unexpected turn of events. So the open palms were correct. It was a knife, not a bottle. Question number 2. Al Capone once opened soup kitchens during the Great Depression to help feed the hungry. Fist if you think this is true, open palm if you think it's false. Now let me see your hands. I'm seeing mostly fists this time. You think it's true? Al, did you really run soup kitchens?
Absolutely true. Starting in 1930, we opened soup kitchens and bread lines in Chicago, fed thousands of people every day, men, women, children who had nowhere else to turn. The government was failing its people, so I stepped in. We served hot meals, no questions asked. Rich or poor, black or white, everybody ate. Some people called it a publicity stunt, but those hungry families didn't care about my motives. They cared about having food in their bellies and hope in their hearts.
So the fists were right again. It was absolutely true. Well, I have to confess something here. I got both questions right. But then again, I'm the one who wrote the questions. Thank you for being such a good sport with our little quiz, Al. And thank you to our wonderful audience for playing along. Well, folks, I'm afraid we're approaching the end of our time together tonight.
Listen to that. Even the dead appreciate a good audience.
It's always bittersweet when we reach this point in our show. Al, as we look back on everything we've discussed tonight, from your childhood in Brooklyn to your rise and fall in Chicago, from your time on Alcatraz to your reflections on legacy and redemption, what stands out to you most?
You know what strikes me, Lily? How similar people are across time. The questions your audience asked tonight about morality, leadership, family, second chances, those are the same questions people were asking in my day. Maybe the clothes change, maybe the technology gets fancier, but people are still trying to figure out how to live a good life in a complicated world. They're still struggling with the same choices between survival and principles, between loyalty and self-preservation, between ambition and contentment.
And what would you want them to take away from your story?
That choices matter. Every single one of them. You might think you're just making a small decision, just cutting one corner, just bending one rule, but those small choices add up. They build on each other. They create momentum. Before you know it, you're living a life you never intended, becoming a person you never meant to be. Or maybe, if you're lucky and wise, you're building something beautiful instead of something destructive. The power is always in your hands. The question is how you choose to use it.
Al Capone, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for sharing your incredible story with us tonight.
Thank you, Lily. This was therapeutic in a way, getting to tell my story in my own words. And thank you to everyone out there listening. You've given an old criminal a chance to maybe balance the scales just a little bit. Until we meet again, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.
What an absolutely extraordinary conversation that was. And thank you to all of you, our wonderful studio audience, and our listeners around the world who are joining us while commuting, working, or just relaxing at home. So tell me, what was the most memorable moment from tonight's interview for you? And now it's time for today's inspirational quote segment. Music, please. Today's quote comes to us from an unexpected source, but one that feels particularly relevant after our conversation tonight. Every saint has a past, and every sinner has a future. Every saint has a past, and every sinner has a future. This quote is attributed to Oscar Wilde, the brilliant Irish playwright and poet who knew something about scandal, redemption, and the complexity of human nature. Wilde understood that we are not defined solely by our worst moments or our best ones, but by the full spectrum of our humanity. In tonight's conversation with Al Capone, we saw this truth in action, a man who committed terrible acts but also showed genuine love for his family, compassion for the hungry, and deep reflection on the consequences of his choices. The quote reminds us that transformation is always possible, that our past doesn't have to determine our future, and that judging people requires understanding the full context of their lives. It's easy to see people as either heroes or villains, but the reality is that most of us are somewhere in between, capable of both great good and great harm, often within the same day. That quote really makes you think, doesn't it? But the first time I heard it, I thought, well, great. I must be that awkward person in line between sinner and saint, just holding up traffic. You know, the one who's trying to return a soul without a receipt? Moral of the story? Always keep your receipt. Heaven's return policy is brutal. What do you think about today's quote? Does it change how you view the people in your life? Or even how you view yourself? Well, our time really is coming to an end now. And what a journey it's been. Thank you so much for staying with us through this entire conversation. Your attention, your engagement, your thoughtful questions, they make this show what it is. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, please don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave us a comment. Let us know who you'd like us to interview next. What historical figure fascinates you? We have so many incredible series available, covering everyone from ancient philosophers to modern innovators. Check out the links in our description. There's something for everyone. And if you'd like to support our show, you can find donation links in the description and that QR code in the corner of your screen. Those donations help keep the lights on here at the studio. And yes, they do help pay my salary too. This podcast is perfect for those times when you need some company. Whether you're doing chores, working out, commuting, or even falling asleep. We're available in multiple languages, so it's great for language learners too. I have to admit, I often listen to our own episodes when I'm feeling lonely or need some inspiration. There's something comforting about these conversations, about connecting with the wisdom and experiences of remarkable people throughout history. Plus, it helps me remember the questions I forgot to ask during the actual interview. Speaking of which, our next guest is someone who changed the world in ways we're still discovering today. I can't tell you who it is yet, but let's just say they knew a thing or two about challenging the status quo. Tune in next time to find out. Until then, this has been Background Interview with your host, Lily. Thank you for listening, thank you for thinking, and thank you for being part of our global community. Take care, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Phew, that was intense. You know, there was something I really wanted to ask him about his relationship with his mother, but every time I tried to bring it up, he got this look in his eyes. I guess some topics are still too personal, even for someone who's been dead for decades. But maybe that's what makes these conversations so fascinating. There's always more to discover. Next time, perhaps. Thanks for listening.